Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes of ancient warfare-related stuff to take a break from whatever's going on in the modern world. Today, I'm going to be answering two questions on the same topic, so two birds with one stone, from Gregorio Garilio, I believe, 7750, a comment from YouTube, and also JSoth2675, another comment from YouTube, both on the same topic, roughly. Gregorio's question was, how many Macedonian and Indian casualties were there at the Battle of Hydaspes, or the Hydaspes River, fought probably in July 326 BC, more of that in a moment. And the second one from JSoth is it possible or even likely that the Battle of Hydaspes against King Porus was fabricated? Are there any Indian sources that agree a battle took place? Great content, as always, and thank you for your time. Thank you, JSoth, for asking a question, and you, Gregorio. Now, first question, we do have multiple Greek and Latin sources for the battle, so we can begin to break down the casualties. They, of course, as so often in ancient sources, don't agree. So your question of how many is in fact complicated by the fact that our sources don't actually agree. But there's a reason. There's some logic. I'll get to that. And secondly, the short answer to your question, JSoth, is I don't believe that it was fabricated. I do believe that it is a battle that took place, but there are extenuating circumstances. The reason for such a question, of course, is that in none of the very rich Indian tradition of history and other writings is Porus even mentioned. And so the idea has sprung up that because we have the Nanda Empire at the same time in northern India, why don't they mention this? And we'll get to that as we go. So getting back to casualties. So our major sources for Alexander in general are Arrian's Anabasis, the stories, the biography of Plutarch, the Alexander biography, the history of Diodorus Siculus, and Quintus Curtius Rufus's stories of Alexander. Some of them, in various different points, more reliable than others. There's also the work of Justin, although Justin for Porus's, or the Battle of the Hydaspes, is there's very little in Justin. And at various different points in the history of Alexander, either or any and some of the sources are more reliable than others. In some others, such as in what I've written on the Battle of the Granicus and even Gaugamela, a combination of those sources give us a better picture than just using one. But with the Hydaspes, I think, and I agree with several other modern ancient historians on that, I think Diodorus offers the best picture, but we'll get to that. So Diodorus tells us that Porus had 50,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry, 1,000 chariots and 130 elephants. Okay. Curtius Rufus gives 30,000 infantry, 300 chariots and 85 elephants. Plutarch, 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. And Arrian, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, 200 elephants, and 30,000 infantry. Now, interestingly, they're not really in agreement. There's a really interesting disparity between cavalry and infantry in all of them, though. And in the accounts of the battle, we know that Alexander outnumbers Porus in terms of cavalry, and so he turns it into a cavalry engagement, although the infantry and the phalanx have a very important part to play. So, short story is when Alexander gets to the Hydaspes River, the modern Jhelum, he looks to cross. Porus, learning that he's coming, basically draws up his army opposite him on the opposite bank. Alexander then splits his forces half to sort of stay there, looking like there are more men than there are, so that Porus will think he's still in position across the river from him. And then with a huge section of his army, he goes and explores elsewhere up the bank to find another place to cross, and eventually does so about 20 kilometers away, which is quite some distance. And so then eventually crosses and, according to one story, mid-storm with lightning bolts and everything, and crosses the river. And then Porus learns that he's crossed, and so ums and ahs for a bit, and then decides to go and face Alexander, draws up his infantry in the center with the elephants in like the towers of a city wall. And so Alexander decides to avoid fighting the infantry and the elephants and fights the cavalry alone, routs the cavalry of Porus, and then it becomes an infantry battle, which is hard fought. And of course, the elephants wreak havoc on the Macedonians, but eventually either their mahouts are killed or they are injured, and they then run amok amongst their own forces as much as the enemy, which is always an issue with elephants in warfare. So it's a victory for Alexander. At the same time, Craterus then crosses, opposing a very small force left by Porus, and so basically runs down many more of the Indians as they flee. So that's the battle in short, very short. Casualties, we are given the casualty figure by Arrian that 20,000 Indian infantry die and 3,000 cavalry. Then also we get the idea of Porus's two sons. Now, opposed to that, we have Macedonian losses of 230 cavalry and 80 infantry, which is very peculiar because elsewhere in the account we talked about the massive losses being inflicted on the Macedonians by the Indian elephants, for instance. Diodorus tells us 12,000 Indian infantry died, including the two sons of Porus, his best generals and officers, and 9,000 men taken alive. Now, you'll note that that's 21,000, quite close to Arrian's 20,000 infantry casualties. And Diodorus also tells us that 80 elephants were captured. Of the Macedonian side, the losses were 280 cavalry, which again is not that far off the 230 cavalry of Arrian, but he tells us more than 700 infantry. Now, that seems to be a much more likely casualty rate than the one that we get in Arrian. 80 infantry, maybe a zero's dropped off or a figure's dropped off. But yeah, I think that Diodorus's numbers are more likely. And so that's where you get that. Now, that's pretty much it, though, which is quite interesting when you've got that number of sources for the battle. And one of the dissatisfying things about so many of our sources is that they disagree so often. And you either have to rationalize them, as I did with the cavalry or the infantry numbers. You also sometimes just have to pick and choose one. And for various reasons, at various times, I think Diodorus, who doesn't get a really good review in modern ancient history, I think that Diodorus is the more reliable. Okay, so now we get on to the second question from Jasoth about whether it's fabricated. I don't think it is. Plutarch mentions several sources, as does Arrian. One of the sources that Plutarch mentions is the letters of Alexander himself, and then Onesicritus and Callisthenes and others. Now, as I say, the major issue is that the Indian sources, very rich Indian sources, don't mention it. But why would they, is the question. Now, of course, one of the things is as Alexander moves eastwards, he encounters Porus, who we're told has a kingdom bordered basically in the Punjab region of Pakistan today, Pakistan and India, that he enters by the Khyber Pass and he comes across Porus's empire, which is bounded by the Hydaspes River and the Esquines River, which is the modern Jhelum and the modern Chenab rivers. Technically speaking, the dynasty of the Magadha Empire in northern India doesn't share a border with this supposed area. Now, for that reason, why would they mention Porus? Because what is peripheral to one could be essential to the other. So as Alexander comes in contact with Porus, it's an essential contact, but it's not an essential part of the history of the Nanda dynasty or the Magadha dynasty of empires of India at the time. I think there are 12 of them. At the same time, some people think that Porus is somehow a name for the Rigvedic tribe of the Purus, who occupy the same region about 1,000 years earlier in Indian history. So there's some kinds of ideas about there being something like Porus at some point in Indian history. Now, the other idea, of course, is that there are names in the Greek and Latin sources, Porus. We get names like Agrames and Exandrames, which is normally identified with the last king of the Nanda dynasty, Dhanananda. The Greek Latin name is nowhere close to the Indian name. When we later get, where have I put it? I've written it somewhere. We later get the idea that, is it in Plutarch? Yes. The idea of the later king of the Mauryan Empire, Androkotos, he's called in Greek, or Sandrakotos, and that's Chandragupta in Indian. So not even similar in the way that they're said in the original, as often happens in the transliteration of, actually all names in Greek and Latin sources. They're often very dissimilar to what we think are the original language names. And so what I think is happening is Alexander comes across Porus, or someone of the Porus tribe, and he fights him, defeats him, and isn't mentioned in contemporary Indian sources, the Puranas and things like that. But I don't believe that he didn't exist. I think that what happens, of course, is that when the Nanda Empire falls, it's replaced by the Mauryan Empire, and they then conquer the area that was Porus's empire, and so come into contact with the Seleucids after Alexander's death. That is basically a power vacuum created by the defeats that Alexander imposes. And even though Porus is then made into the satrap of India by Alexander, we're told by multiple of our sources that he loses so many of his men. He loses his son, so there's no dynasty. He loses his best officers. So essentially, you've created not only a power vacuum of men, but their commanders. And so they're then wiped from the face of history to be replaced by the Mauryan Empire, which I think explicates what's going on. So I don't believe that it was fabricated. And there are several other aspects of Indian history that Alexander and the sources for Alexander are accurate on. So there's no reason to entertain the idea that it's just a made-up battle, made-up enemy, made-up conquest. But of course, one of the massive issues we have with ancient history is when things that would agree don't, or we expect corroboration and we don't get it. But that's just one of those things you have to accept. Otherwise, you'll go mad. Anyway, you, of course, can ask us a question. Thank you to the latest question answer who said if they could have, they would have sent a telegram. Love that. I hopefully will get to that question later. Otherwise, I look forward to joining you on the next issue of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.